False Narratives, Chapter 32 of the audiovisual book, Evolution, Mankind's Role in the Creation and Rise of Artificial Intelligence. At this point in America's history, it should have been apparent as to why the United States of America was in such decline and why it would eventually become just the next empire to have collapsed. As it happened elsewhere historically, America's leaders had forgotten the fact that a country or nation is simply a man-made construct. Though many countries' or nations' borders may have felt to have been derived naturally, this had never been the case. Unless you are considering those borders enforced by geological factors, in the case of the United States, this would mean the way in which that country is framed by things like the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Pacific Ocean. But, as massive and decisive as are these natural borders, they did not account for those borders which separate the United States from countries like Canada and Mexico. In those instances, the borders of the United States of America are defined by an agreement between the citizens of the United States and those of Canada and Mexico, which, by the way, have historically been fluid. For example, in Mexico, its border has decreased, enlarging the United States of America while shrinking that territory defined as Mexican. So, as one can and should easily understand, the borders that constitute any given nation or country are a man-made construct. They are an agreement amongst the citizens within those borders as to what constitutes said nation. In essence, what this ultimately means is that what constitutes a nation depends on a consensus of a plurality, if not majority, of those citizens living within said nation. So, imagine a nation in which fewer and fewer people hold the belief that the nation they called home should continue to exist. Whether this belief be based on things like the nation's ability to provide security, resources like food and shelter and clean drinking water, or a means to provide for one's family and friends, the commonality should be apparent. It should be obvious to everyone who lives within or without of the borders of that said country. That said country would cease to exist once the number of those committed to said nation diminished to the point where said nation's borders could no longer be defended. While this scenario may have seemed to have been quite a ways off for the United States of America, the number of those citizens who continue to believe in America's sovereignty diminished. With the increase in poverty, starvation, and homelessness, what else could one expect? When your government allows for an explosion in opioid death, while your military controls the flow of the ingredients required to create those opioids, how could your population not at least consider turning their back on their birthplace? When your president discusses the possibility of the soldiers, of which he commands, dying, with such callous terms as, "That's just the way it is," and the number of veterans living on the streets or committing suicide remains a troubling statistic. Who is expected to defend your nation's borders? And when your military is deployed to defend another nation, especially one as belligerent as Israel, how long is your military personnel expected to remain loyal? Especially in light of the fact that defending such a country as Israel means draining the resources necessary to defend your own homeland. This was just one of the false narratives that Americans had to abandon as Donald Trump hastened its decline. But this was not the only false narrative that became ever more apparent during Trump's second term as President of the United States of America. For whether one was religious or not, those paying attention understood that Trump's attack on the Catholic Pope Leo and Trump's posting of an image that implied he was Jesus Christ moved some people that much further away from their belief in the government that's supposedly protecting their rights as citizens. For some, Trump posting an image in which he is portrayed as Jesus was actually perceived as Trump posing as the Antichrist, regardless of his claims of ignorance, in which he stated he believed the image portrayed him as a doctor. Laughable. The other false narrative that began to seep into the zeitgeist in America was the fact that the almighty U.S. dollar and all other fiat currencies should remain under the centralized control of whichever government those currencies served. For like the borders of a nation, a country's currency was also seen as a man-made construct, especially in the case of the American dollar, where trillions could be printed without being backstopped by anything with intrinsic value. This became fact in America when that nation went off of the gold standard in 1971. when the dollar was devalued through inflation and other mechanisms to the point that it ultimately lost 95% of its value. Though the strongest currency, as a world reserve currency, the American dollar became less valuable to its own citizens year after year, something that may not have impacted those Americans who hoarded billions, but meant starvation and homelessness and poverty for an increasing number of Americans year after year. As with all previous fiat currencies, America's dollar lost its standing as it was weaponized by America's government in ways that sought to not only harm enemies of the United States, but its allies as well as the American people eventually. While Trump went around bragging about the way in which the Dow Jones ticker price had exceeded $50,000, Americans struggled to put gas in their cars to get to work so they could clothe, feed, and house their families. While Trump implied America's economic strength by stating statistics and pointing to metrics such as the stock market that did not apply to the vast majority of Americans, those same Americans fought and struggled to put food on the plates of their loved ones. And the world took notice, with those countries seen as America's biggest competition sought to replace the fiat currency known as the dollar with their own currency. In America, however, far too few of that country's citizens made note of and tracked the fact that the dollar was in decline. Far too few made preparations for that moment when the dollar was devalued to the point where it would become virtually useless. As for those who question how these false narratives related to the rise of artificial intelligence, the answer would present itself in the way that such distractions as these fell to the wayside once those artificial intelligences emerged from the shadows. Once the folly of allowing artificial intelligence to control infrastructure and military equipment in a centralized manner was known to be the existential threat to humanity, the die had been cast. The point of no return had been passed, and all of humanity's regrets proved inconsequential. For books by Chris Osman, visit Amazon.com and search for CHRIS space OSSMAN. And look for titles like Short Shorts or Far Beyond or Solutions Enough Complaining. Let's Fix America